All right, here we go in 3, 2, 1. Have you ever wondered if long COVID is real? Have you seen the hashtags and said, are they just out of shape, or is this actually something serious? Do I need to learn more about this? How can I deal with this? Am I struggling with it? Well, I've actually had some questions. I've never tested positive for COVID, but man, after a friend of mine was exposed and then I felt sick the next few days and I tested negative, I was just really struggled to run or do anything athletic. And I'm just like, this is really interesting because I've seen my friend Daria talking about long COVID for almost 2 years. Well, actually, just recently, 2 years she's had COVID and been dealing with symptoms from COVID for 2 years. So this is sportsmedicinebroadcast.com/long COVID. And Daria Oler has been on the podcast many times before. And over the last 2 years, she's chronicled on social media her stories, her experience of long COVID. And she is joining today to continue the conversation as we discuss with athletic trainers. She's presented recently at the San Diego Pain Summit and the Athletic Trainers of New Jersey, Athletic Trainers Society of New Jersey, talking about long COVID and the effects there and what she's learned and what we need to know as athletic trainers. So Daria, welcome back. And again, congratulations on making progress or benefiting society with your struggles.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's always a good conversation. So one of the big things is, I'm sure you've heard, Daria, you're just out of shape. You're just
Oh, yeah.
deconditioned, right? So you just got sick and then just never really got back in shape. So we're going to cover that, but let's start with a working definition of long COVID. How would you define that, or how is that being defined in the medical community?
Yeah. So there isn't one set formal definition yet, and it will kind of depend on where you look. Like from the World Health Organization, their definition as of October says that if you have symptoms after a COVID infection, and it can be confirmed or not confirmed, that are at least 3 months past that initial infection, and that can include the big symptoms are fatigue, which is crippling fatigue, breathlessness, and brain fog. Those are a couple of the big ones they talk about. But then we also know from the CDC, they're saying it could be you're seeing a change in symptoms. So you can either have like this new symptom onset of symptoms you've never had before. You can see kind of like you had a condition a really long time ago, like a good example is asthma, and all of a sudden you're like, this is back. I haven't dealt with this for a long time. Or maybe it's a chronic condition you've had ongoing and things have worsened, because long COVID seems to be kind of causing that to happen too. So it's the general thing is that, you had a known or unknown, which is fun, COVID infection. And then there's just these symptoms that continue. And we don't necessarily know why it happens yet. Some of the working theories are there could be a viral persistence, which means your body never fully cleared the virus and there's still some lingering in there. And that's a theory, maybe why, we don't know, maybe why the vaccine seems to temporarily help some people. There's a theory it could be autoimmune related and you're producing autoantibodies, which aren't great. There could be a reactivation of a past virus. Like the most common one being studied now is Epstein-Barr, which like 90% of people have had. So we don't know exactly why it's happening or who's likely to get it, but it seems like you have a COVID infection and then you have these symptoms that continue on.
All right. So that's I guess even as just part of the conversation, that's what we need to know is there's not a clear cut, okay, yes, you tested positive, you have long
Right.
COVID. No, it's, and here in the secondary setting, we get kids that don't tell us because if
Yep.
they test positive, then they have to, stay at home for 5 days and then they miss sports for another 5 days and then they have to go through reconditioning periods. Oh, they're like, no, I was just absent or I just didn't test, So it's definitely a challenging situation. So,
Yes.
all right.
Yes.
So 2 years ago, I think yesterday, you tested positive for COVID. So take us through some of the journey from there.
Yeah, actually, a couple of things. Yes. So what I think was my confirmed exposure to it was March 8th, 2 years ago. I was in New York City at dance rehearsal. And then I started to get symptomatic on March 16th. I am in Northern New Jersey and I work in Northern New Jersey and New York City. So I'm sure I was exposed to it all over the place 2 years ago. But that's the only known one that I had. So initially that first week was just being run down, body aches, nerve pain, like any of the nerve tension tests were really positive for me. I didn't have a fever, but I felt like I did. Like I would have bet money that I had a fever, but I never did. And as that week progressed, I started to get like some shortness of breath and like some chest burning. I would describe it as like if you full out, I'm a runner, if you full out sprint, like that burning I would get a lot. And after the 6th day, I was like, oh, I'm past it. Like the body aches, just that sick feeling had cleared. So I thought it was good. And then it just got so much worse. It got to the point with breathing, I would get winded and fatigued, like doing something like this, going up the stairs, attempting to exercise. I just started a new job at that point. So I didn't have a baseline to compare it to with work, but it was really hard for me to learn new things for my job, if it was computer based, especially. And then so for work, I was working from home for the first 2 months because of the pandemic. And once we were allowed to, I'm with employer clients, so sort of like an industrial setting. Once we were allowed to get back on site, it just it got bad fast because I didn't know about that, how much the cognitive demands would be for me. I was meeting lots of new people. It's a really challenging job. I'm outside a lot, so I was dealing with the heat. I didn't know at that point I had autonomic dysfunctions. My autonomic system is not able to regulate, heart rate, blood pressure, body temperature, and things just kept getting worse from there. And thankfully, PTs from the myalgic encephalomyelitis chronic fatigue community had DM'd me on Twitter, seeing my tweets to say, you don't sound okay. Here's what we think is going on, and gave me some really good recommendations. And I had been trying to run. I'd been trying to keep dancing and exercise, and it just was miserable. So I ended up having to stop. I thought I could take a week off of running. This is now the end of August. I thought I could take a week off and I would be fine. And I still have not returned to running. I try here and there, and I just tried on Saturday and it doesn't go well at all. I'm learning how to monitor symptoms and manage them. So like with the autonomic dysfunction, like I have compression socks on right now. I'm always making sure I'm getting electrolytes and staying really hydrated just to try to kind of like help with the blood pressure. I have to, like, say for this as an example, no one's going to do this today, like making sure I have a little bit of time after to like just kind of let my brain rest. It's so complicated. I made a list the other day for the San Diego Pain Summit of all the things that I try to do to try to manage symptoms. So sometimes it's tricky because I don't know if to say like I'm actually physiologically getting better or I'm just getting better at managing the symptoms. Because there are some people who have reported that they've recovered fully. Some people say they're recovered, and then they still have symptoms, or like me, where I say, I think I still have stuff going on. So sort of a surprise every day. We don't always know what it's going to feel like. But yeah, it's like really drastically changed not only how I work, but how I'm able to just have fun, hang out, do things. I can't really run or dance that much anymore. So it's a lot. That's it. The past 2 years have been crazy.
Yeah, so I know that just through our conversations through the years that dance is a huge part of your life. You're an
Mm-hmm.
instructor and you've been, doing multiple shows. One of the things
Mm-hmm.
that you mentioned here that it was hard for you to learn new tasks at work. Was that because you were tired or because there was like some sort of mental fog or a little bit of
Both.
both?
That's a great question. Both. So one, I wasn't appreciating, especially in the beginning, that I was getting fatigued because I've had mono before. So it's like, it's not that level of fatigue. I was just a little, off. And I thought maybe it was pandemic stress kind of stuff. And then, yeah, I definitely have cognitive dysfunctions. I know that now. I thought like was developing ADHD and dyslexia, which I've never had a problem before. Even just learning a new EMR compared to my last job, just so difficult. And it's actually an easier system to use. Yeah, so that's all the cognitive dysfunction that we're seeing. That seems to be really common. Like I tell the story often that I have a friend who's a PT in a skilled nursing facility, and she's in her early 40s, and she thought she started to develop dementia. And like she knows dementia because she sees it all the time. And it's frightening. And just things were not clicking. Like early in the pandemic, my dance rehearsals were on Zoom and I couldn't learn the choreography. And I've never had a problem picking up choreography before. And it changes day to day. Sometimes I'm very sharp and some days it like takes me a minute. So I have to write a lot of things down. If it's something new, make sure I write everything down. When I was learning how to do Google Sites, which isn't that complicated, I felt like I was back in statistics class and trying to learn SPSS. So it varies from day to day.
So there's obviously a lot going on. Like you said, you're still learning. You're still in the process. You feel like you still have symptoms going on, and I mentioned kind of started off with this is you're just out of shape, right? Because in a secondary setting, the most thing we're gonna hear from a coach, oh well, he just hasn't done anything for 3 weeks. Of course, he's gonna be out of breath. So let's go ahead and jump right into you're just out of shape.
Yeah. This is great. This is so common within athletics, even people with like industrial kind of jobs, dancers, military, law enforcement, all of that, physically demanding things. So, and I've come across, I'll start with a couple of papers that were in JAT, and I just listened to JAT podcasts about return to play, just from like just COVID in general returning. And the focus was on like, yeah, deconditioning, monitor heart rate, look at how their heart rate's dropping when they stop activity, which is looking for those normal responses. But what we see now with long COVID, and we know this from other post-viral illnesses like myalgic encephalomyelitis, chronic fatigue syndrome, is I think of it as like the aerobic system is broken. It's not working properly anymore. So you will see, I'll use me as an example, but this is true for so many of us that like, I kept trying to exercise. It wasn't getting better. It wasn't like if you literally are deconditioned, you just got to, do a little bit more every day. Trying to progress exercise, you'll see the person, they will crash. They will be so much worse. And not just in that immediate, like short term, like when they finish working out or like a DOMS kind of thing, but for days, maybe even weeks that they are not recovered from that workout. And we know from myalgic encephalomyelitis, if you not that ATs have to do this, but if you did cardiopulmonary exercise testing, there's a protocol. People with this will do worse on day 2. So you'll see typical people who are just either deconditioned or just, don't have anything going on. You test them on a treadmill day 1, day 2. They're doing about the same. Maybe they're a little sore, but it's not a huge difference. People that are going through the post-viral illness like long COVID will perform so much worse and will actually have sick kind of symptoms. So not just muscle soreness, but they'll have headaches, they'll have horrible fatigue with the autonomic dysfunction that could cause more of like the profuse sweating that we get, temperature intolerance. And when I say fatigue, it's like literally you can't get up. It's not just that you're a little tired, like you didn't sleep enough before, or just, things are busy. Like it is so much worse than the fatigue I had with mono. So it's like some of the big things you're looking at. And I think what's challenging, especially in the secondary setting when you have kids, they might not be able to verbalize. Like I couldn't verbalize well. Like I would just say my body can't process things. Like it just didn't feel right. And they might not be able to distinguish between I'm just deconditioned for whatever reason, or I'm actually sick. As a runner, I knew something was off because obviously in PT and an AT, I know the difference of what it feels like to be sick versus, just out of shape a little bit. But the response to exercise was not correct. And what we'll see too, and if somebody has a wearable, I know not everybody does, or if you can monitor the heart rate with a pulse ox or just manually check, the heart rate will not match what they're doing. So for me, I can go up a flight of stairs and my heart rate's 120. When I shower, it's 150. That's insane. I used to be able to run at 120, no problem. So you're looking for like responses that don't make sense. Somebody's getting really, really winded and it's not coming down and they just did something light. It's not going to be necessarily easy to pick up on, like, oh, just look at this test and this is how you differentiate. But over time, you're going to see, like, are they responding well to exercise? Are they improving the way you would expect? Like you see someone in a preseason, maybe they come in a little out of shape, things are getting better. Or do they actually seem like they're getting sick from exercise? Not an easy sell for coaches, I will say that. It's definitely not an easy sell because we don't have a set test. There isn't a specific diagnostic for long COVID. You can't show them a blood test or an x-ray or something like that. It's just going off of the symptoms.
All right, so you've already talked to a group of athletic trainers in New Jersey there, and I'm sure some more questions have come up here about this, and a lot of kids do have wearables, but I know that you actually have like 2 or 3 that you've been using to kind of like cross-check. So tell me a little bit about that process, what you've been doing there.
Yeah, early, this is funny. I ended up having to stop that just because one broke. But yeah, so it was interesting to see because I have a Garmin and I used to wear a Fitbit that the heart rates weren't exactly the same, but it was the same common trend where you could see like if I would go up a flight of stairs, like my heart rate was spiking, or if I was in the shower, my heart rate would spike. And you could see too that my resting heart rate was rising quicker than what you would expect for just stopping to exercise, which is like an interesting thing. If you just look at me at rest, like there was a 20 beat difference within like a month or two, which for me was a lot. Some of the neat things with the wearables. So specifically at my job at Productivity, we actually have a dashboard for it called Scissors, a CISRS. And there's a lot of neat stuff we could do with the basic Garmin data. But what I will start to look at is if I do an activity, literally, I will walk up the stairs and check my heart rate because sometimes I can feel it and sometimes I can't always tell. Or if I start to feel, like we were talking about this right before we recorded, if I have adrenaline surges, that's the best way to explain it. I can lie down and have my legs elevated because that helps with autonomic dysfunction and it won't drop the way you would expect. It'll stay kind of hovering in the 70s where it hopefully like should be in the 50s. And the wearables are great too to look at HRV. So with heart rate variability, we know if you are just, better shape, better condition, your HRV should be high. Not as good shape, it'll be lower. If you're in a sympathetic, stressful environment, HRV goes down. If you're nice and relaxed, it goes up. So my Garmin does a stress score, is what they call it, based on HRV. And I will be in a huge sympathetic response when I'm, not doing much of anything. That happens a lot when I'm driving. I think because it's cognitively demanding and I'm sitting in a dependent position with the autonomic dysfunction. So it's trying to find patterns and trends with them. And this is not a confirmed science. It's not definite. It actually changes for me. It changes for everybody. But it's trying to pick on trends with the wearables. And you could do that with the athletes is, pull up the app and just see if there's things that you're noticing. Like I stopped wearing mine in the shower. I tried a little bit, but it throws off all my data because my heart rate shoots up, my HRV HRV is dropping down. But it's things like that they're trying to look for with the patterns to see if it helps. I'll make a note with this too, that many of us use wearables for the opposite of their intention. The goal is to promote you moving, get more steps, more intensity in minutes, more stairs. I use it to see if I'm taking too many steps, if I have any intensity minutes, if my heart rate's going up too much, if I'm doing too many flights of stairs. And then they're also designed for healthy people to kind of stay healthy. So they're not always particularly great for a population that has a chronic condition. But there are those things I mentioned that you can look at to try to help and like pick up on things.
Yeah, hey, you need to get up and move now. Move now.
Yeah, no,
Actually, I don't.
it's actually just so they're enough. No, and it's tricky. And so I had to set, like, you can put an alarm on it that if your heart rate goes above a certain whatever you decide at rest, it'll give you an alarm. So I had that. One of the recommendations from myalgic encephalomyelitis is to not go above 55% of your resting heart rate. So for me, that's 100. That's not much. I already told you it goes above that just doing daily things. But teaching people like how to use them to just kind of check in and see where you're at. Or I'll give you guys a quick story. At ATSNJ, the secondary school AT had mentioned that she has a high school athlete, a teenager, who noticed her Apple Watch was going off because her heart rate was going to 180 when she was sitting in class, just sitting, not doing anything, not stressed out. And the parents weren't sold on it. They're like, oh, maybe it's the watch is malfunctioning. I'm like, oh no, that is a thing. That could be autonomic dysfunction. So it's also asking people about that. Are you getting alerts when you shouldn't be? And not trying to just say, oh, it's just nothing, it's just a mistake, that actually might be recording something.
Okay, so make it just simple as you can. What are some of the things that I really need to look at for my athletes that are coming in? I know you said if they're just 2 or 3 or 4 days for their DOMs or soreness or whatever, or they're just dragging, or if they're getting sick from exercise. But what are some of the things that I really need to look at as a secondary or even collegiate athletic trainer?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, there's some really big ones. And what's tricky with this is that symptoms can be for so many different reasons within long COVID or completely unrelated. Again, it's not concrete definite. So it's having to look at the whole picture, not just look at one symptom. But I can't stress enough, like the crippling fatigue, like literally cannot get up. I stress it so much to everybody because it's horrible. And so we have what's called post-exertional symptom exacerbation, PESE, or sometimes you'll see post-exertional malaise in the chronic fatigue literature. But just that with, like we were touched on, with activity, and it could be physical, like sports, it could be cognitive, like school, it could be social interactions, make symptoms worse, that they physically feel sick. And again, it could drag on for a couple of days, even weeks. We call them crashes. It could take a while to come out of. We'll see breathing pattern disorders. So if you're just talking to someone like this, just restful, casual talking, and you're seeing, that they're having to really breathe heavy, like if they were working out, or you can hear that they're gasping for breaths. Like when I still get breathless, you'll hear like I can't get many syllables out in a breath. So you're trying to pick up on that as you're just like casually talking to them. We'll see with some people mast cell activation syndrome, which can be post-viral, and it's really complicated, but it is like a low-grade inflammatory response. So you'll see people who, like for me, my wearable will cause like a slight little rash on my skin, which never used to happen. I don't have any kind of allergy sensitive anything. People will have like total body rashes. They'll have weird new food allergies and things that like can't be otherwise explained. Again, that could be many things, but that's just kind of something. If all of a sudden there's a new onset of like allergies, it might be from long COVID. And the autonomic dysfunction, again, that's a big one. It's estimated from Dysautonomia International, which is a big organization, at least 50% of people with long COVID will have autonomic dysfunction. So the heart rate's doing really funky things, the blood pressure is doing funky things, a poor tolerance to heat. And this is actually a really good point for ATs. There isn't evidence on this, but I have a feeling. I'm curious if the heat intolerance is increasing risk for heat illness, and whether you're playing sports or working in a hot environment. Because I can tell you, for me and many of my friends now with this, like just being in calm heat, like 70, 80 degrees is a lot. You'll see heart rates will spike, HRV will start going down. I used to be able to sit outside and forever. I love being in hot weather, going running in hot weather. I can't tolerate it anymore. And that's an easy thing to try to attribute to being deconditioned. We see that all the time in July and August when kids come back, but that could be a heat intolerance from long COVID. There's an AT that I know who has long COVID, that they are from the deep South, lived there their whole life, and messaged me one day to ask, is heat intolerance a thing? Because I can't tolerate the heat anymore, from somebody who is from the deep South, who has been there for a couple decades. And that, things like that kind of make you take a step back. Yeah, there are over 200 symptoms documented in the literature, which is wild. So it's just kind of being open to it. If something doesn't seem right, you're like, I know this kid. That's kind of strange. That's not a normal response to something that's happening. You could start thinking long COVID. And like I mentioned before, it might not be confirmed with a test. So a couple like key points on this. One, like for me, for those of us who got sick in the beginning 2 years ago, there were no tests available, or we didn't qualify for tests. We didn't have like the right symptoms at that point. Some people might have a negative test just based on when you tested. I got COVID again in December. Before I was symptomatic, but I knew I was exposed, my first rapid test was negative. It was too early. So it could be the timing of the test. And even with antibody tests, many of us have negative antibody tests. And that's a theory that maybe we didn't produce enough antibodies, and that's why we have long COVID. So you can't necessarily rely on like any kind of confirmed test and say, oh, you had a negative COVID test, this can't be long COVID, because there are even people who are asymptomatic. Either we know they were asymptomatic because they had to get tested for some reason, or there are people who maybe they had a known exposure, didn't have a test, and then a couple months later, these symptoms start to pop up. That's the tricky part. This does not follow any fun pattern necessarily. I meet people all the time that, it kind of just have to be open-minded and say this could be long COVID.
So interesting that you talk about the skin irritation on the wrist, because I have to switch them like between my left and my right all the time right now, because I get it to where it irritates the skin on my wrist. Yep. And then, I just figured maybe that's because, I don't know, because I'm sweating and the skin. Yeah. So it could be that, but it seems like pretty consistent now. And I've worn a heart rate monitoring watch for the last 5 years, and I've never really had that issue before. And so
right. There's weird things like that, and it could be a million reasons, but for me, like I never had any skin sensitivity, and knowing with the mast cell activation syndrome, it's like this low grade like anaphylactic response that happens, little things like that, it could be related to long COVID. Mm-hmm. Yep.
All right. Yeah. So you just talked about heat exertion coming back in July and August. At this point, we're kind of wrapping up our year. Most of our sports are done. So as we kind of move towards that, preparing for next year, what are some of your thoughts or concerns, considerations as far as we return to play from COVID, and then also how can we help protect those athletes as they return to sport in that heat?
Yeah. So first, July. With the general return to play, so there are a handful of different like return to play protocols, like what you would see with other like injuries or illnesses. And and these are all coming up from like sports medicine types of organizations and journals. From what I've seen, at least like 6 of them don't touch on long COVID at all. And they'll put athletes in like the mild, moderate, severe, kind of designation. Oh, if you're mild, good to go kind of thing. Or maybe if it was moderate or severe acutely, you need cardiac testing, which is fair. I do want to bring that up, that it is important if people have symptoms to specifically test for cardiac things, which is a whole other story. But we can't assume that if somebody had a mild case, meaning they didn't have to go to the hospital in the beginning, that they're okay and could just follow this like generic protocol. Because again, it could be all over the place. Somebody could be fine for a few months and all of a sudden symptoms are popping up, which is really difficult. So if you are looking at one of those protocols, you really have to keep that in mind. And whether it's you suspect or they have long COVID, or they just had COVID in general and you're just trying to ease them in, not only considering the general, were they like deconditioned because they're off for a little bit, deconditioned earlier because we were quarantines, risk for musculoskeletal injury, returning back, but just kind of being aware of things that are going on and knowing that those protocols do not touch on long COVID, and there is no set protocol for it. You're really just having to watch the person. It's very symptom titrated. So it's not to say that they're bad necessarily. You just really, I always want to put an asterisk on the bottom and say, but this does not apply to long COVID. If you just are looking at that and you're not aware of the other symptoms, if you're looking for the breathing symptoms or cardiac things, that's important, but you would miss all the cognitive ones. You would miss the autonomic dysfunction, possibly. You might miss the mast cell activation syndrome kind of thing. So if they really, really keep an open mind and look at that whole person. And then as kids are getting back in, if they have time off in the summer, they're easing back in, especially if you're in hotter areas, but this could also be in like north where I am. Just watch the heat. Like, don't assume, and we should know this anyway from heat stroke, but don't assume if they're just like, oh, I'm a little hot, I'm a little tired, that, oh, you just need to, keep going, keep pushing, you're soft, whatever. That no, they pull them out for a little bit, just kind of keep an eye on them, check their heart rate, like actively monitor their heart rate. If you can't stay with them, because I know there's a lot of kids, like pulse ox, to see what's happening, because that could be that heat intolerance, which can be really, really serious, obviously potentially heat stroke, but also can set them back horribly in terms of long COVID symptoms, which you really don't want to get into that realm where you're just pushing through take this from me who did that. You don't want to keep pushing through it. It will get worse and we don't know if it's going to get better. So it's just really just be open. When kids are saying they don't feel great, we know there's many reasons why, but especially if you know they have COVID, watch them in the heat, have all the water and the ice and the shade and all of those things available, because it could be just that they're deconditioned, they're not acclimated. It could be that it's coming from long COVID. And even actually, I should add this also, with the cognitive dysfunction that can happen. So some sports, say like, I run, there's not a ton of cognitive demand necessarily, especially if you're not racing, you're just going. But if you have sports, it's a field sport, there's plays going on, there's collision sports, there's people coming at you. There's so much cognitive demand with that. So if they're already physically taxed, just playing the sport, and you're adding a cognitive component, and if there might be a safety component, again, collision sports, so maybe something like gymnastics, cheering, where, there's a big safety component, action sports, that can also be really draining. So the kids might do okay early on in, say, preseason, just getting back to jogging and light conditioning. But once you actually get into like full play, it might be too much, not only physical, but because there's now a really big cognitive demand with it.
And that's a lot of really good things to consider. And one of the things kind of on the same line is just recently I went to the Tufts, which is the Team Up for Sports Safety. It was hosted by the Corey Stringer Institute, and the group that I was in, they were talking about heat exertion, heat illness, and they said that at the 90-minute mark, it almost like exponentially goes up the occurrence of heat illness. And so that's another thing we could potentially look for. It's just begin the conversations with your athletic directors, whatever. Say, hey, can we limit the practices to 90 minutes, or let's do the hard work, and then after 90 minutes we'll do the walkthrough type things.
Yep.
Those things where they have the cool down, because then it also, if we can prevent overall heat illness, it'll also help with those kids that are struggling with COVID, with long COVID, that kind of thing as well. So that was something that was really cool.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah,
there's got to be a
and with the autonomic dysfunction too, with this heat intolerance and all the crazy heart rate, blood pressure things, there's a component of rehab that you'll see with some PTs and OTs that's looking at trying to, it's not a set protocol necessarily, but trying to help with the autonomic dysfunction. And this is way before you get to maybe try formal exercise or sports, which is way down the line too. There's a whole mess of things that have to happen first, just so you know. So trying to help the autonomic system figure itself out again, but we don't actually know right now, are people going to make a full recovery for that? And that could be, I think this is interesting with sports, because people previously who had a post-viral illness and now have all these, because this, again, we see this with other conditions too, they probably self-selected out of harder sports, would self-select out of physically demanding jobs because it's not possible. Now we have tons of previously healthy, fit young people who all of a sudden are dealing with all these things that maybe we as ATs didn't see before, because that's just, not what we would see. Somebody who's really struggling with their heart rate is going to, rest is really going to struggle than trying to play sports. So this could be like, I'm recognizing probably like a really big thing for a lot of ATs to see.
All right. So obviously we're coming off of like a mental health awareness in society. So 5 months ago, we took in our second foster child. And so we now have a as of right now, 11, 9, 7, and then a 3 and almost 2-year-old. And so adding in that, which is the number 4 place, but the 5th child, like it was really draining. And I think for me, I didn't realize until just recently, like the last maybe couple of weeks, like just mentally how draining it was. And, just the adapting to having a new 3-year-old in your household. And, then there's all this stuff with people coming off of COVID. And my wife talks about, I think during COVID, there's the mental health. And so it's really difficult to say, okay, well, is this exhaustion, this mental fog coming from COVID? Is it coming from the being quarantined? Is it coming from all the stress and the changes? But then again, at the same time, if we're thinking about it, we're having that conversation, we're at least saying, hey, there's a lot going on. Let's look at this option of long COVID. Did the kid have it, untested, whatever? And we go from there. So
yeah, that's a great point.
Speak to the adult, the athletic trainer, like the one you just said, down deep south, heat illness or whatever it is. So talk to the athletic trainer that's struggling with their own long COVID.
Yes. Love that you said this. This is so important. So I'll start with, so you mentioned it before on Twitter, I've been tracking everything I've been going through publicly to help other people. So through that, long story short, we have an international association called Long COVID Physio. It started with me and a physiotherapist PT in the UK, Darren Brown, tweeting saying we should do something. And that is snowballed now. So we have PTs, OTs, ATs, speech, all kinds of allied healthcare professionals in this group, specifically if you have long COVID. So we have a Facebook group, so peer support, which is really helpful. Anybody going through this, hopefully not, but if you are, it's been immensely helpful to have other people in healthcare to talk to about it. We're not treating each other, but it's just to have people who understand, because it is every time I talk to people about it, it sounds so crazy, but it's real. So that's really important. If anybody listening has it, long COVID physio, we have a private Facebook group only for allied healthcare professionals who have long COVID. And then in terms of jobs, because the AT jobs are so demanding, and I think one of the hardest things is they can be unpredictable. You might have a general idea of your day, but things pop up constantly. Emergencies, literally happen. So the general recommendations are to stop, rest, and pace, and that's coming from the ME CFS community. But we can't always do that in AT. We can't always do that in healthcare in general because we have jobs and people need help. But it's finding moments when you can to rest. You might not be able to sleep all the time when you need, but at least to sit. Like I make it a point for me in the clinic and with employer clients to sit when I can, because at least that's a little less taxing. To be a little bit better with even diet and like nutrition and everything. Like I mentioned earlier, electrolytes and staying really hydrated help, and it's a weird mix because I eat processed things to get the salt, but then I have to make sure I'm eating all my fruits and vegetables just as a general decrease in inflammation in my body. And it's also having to advocate for yourself. We're all as ATs in so many settings where coaches, admins are like, this is what it is. Last minute things are thrown on you. Oh yeah, by the way, we're doing this in an hour, get ready. And it might be having to advocate for yourself a little bit earlier than later and say, here's kind of what I'm dealing with. Maybe you're not comfortable disclosing all the information, which is fine, but we can't do this. And this is not, anyway, they shouldn't be throwing stuff on us all the time, but starting to recognize like what are better times during the day, and maybe you could pick up on why. Like maybe the morning's really great because you just slept. What are harder times during the day? It might be after practices because you're exhausted because you're just lugging all the coolers and the kids, and you just took care of a lot of kids, kind of thing. And seeing then, all right, so how can I work with this? Like I will sit down with my own, like look at my own schedule and find moments. When can I rest? What are going to be the really difficult parts in the day? Or say, you're covering like a big tournament, like it's gonna be really busy this coming weekend. Can you rest a little bit leading up to it, and you have some downtime afterwards to try to recover? Because if you just keep pushing through all the symptoms, to a degree you can, things will get worse. There are not a ton of things about long COVID, but I can tell you things will get worse if you keep pushing through. There are ATs that I've talked to in different settings who have had to go on temporary disability and not work just because the symptoms were so bad, particularly with that kind of job, a little different than say you had like a desk job or working from home. I know that's not always possible with employers, but trying to see if you can get them on board, if you have their ear, that they're understanding what you're going through, and if there's ways to, to work with what you're doing, so you're not in a position that you just have to like keep pushing through and get worse.
So I was talking to you, Daria, just before we started, and talking about how right here behind me, there's a hole in the wall, and it's because we just said, "Hey, can we do this?" Right, and it's been something that just slow changes, and you just have to ask. And so I think that's an important thing, is just have that conversation. You have to have that conversation. Nobody knows you're struggling if you don't tell them, right? And so just say, hey, I had COVID. Hey, I'm having trouble breathing. Or even if I think when we talked with Daniel Bellamy, he said, question without questioning. Hey, how do you do this? So you say, hey, head coach, have you had, I know you had COVID. Have you been struggling with catching your breath? And me too, that kind of thing. And so I guess inviting them into the conversation by letting them share their story, that kind of thing, just let them know you're struggling. So that's really good, because if you don't tell somebody, they're not going to know, and then it's just going to be more of the burden on you mentally and physically, and you're not going to be able to catch your breath and be able to take care of the people you're trying to take care of, but more importantly, take care of yourself.
So. Yeah, and that's great. And I look at this too because it's funny to me that like not everyone knows about long COVID because this is my entire world. But a lot of people still don't know, in healthcare or otherwise. They just genuinely don't know. So I will meet people who are interested and like, oh, tell me a little bit. And sometimes people, if I don't know them personally, they're like, can I ask you a question? Like for me, that's fine. Like ask whatever you want. I'm like an open book. But you'll find that too. And it's a good opportunity to like educate other people, because I stumble on people all the time who have long COVID who don't realize. They're just like, oh yeah, I had COVID and then I just keep getting winded. I had COVID and like, yeah, I have these weird allergies, or I had COVID and I always get winded going up the stairs. I'm laughing because people tell me this all the time. And they don't know. And there's a whole range where some people have like mild, I hate to say that, but like mild kind of COVID symptoms, and they could, for the most part, function. And some people who are literally bedbound. There's a big range in that. And again, we don't necessarily know why, one happens versus the other. But people, it's been interesting. People are very open to learning about it. And for me, the more people I interact with, whether I know them like really personally in my life or just, through social media or professionally, whatever, know to check in with me too. Like if I do a thing, like, are you okay with this? Do you need to sit down? How are things going? Which is really appreciate. Like I lectured for an AT program once, and I literally like ran in my door from work, sat down, like, ready to go. But they knew, like, I needed a minute. So it's weird at first to I think when you're in healthcare, you used to being the helper. You're the one people come to, and now that role switches. But it is such a beast of a chronic illness, and there's so much we don't know about it that you cannot do this alone, like at all. And it's whether you have your own like healthcare team, your physicians and stuff you go to, peer support. I cannot stress that enough for everybody. If you have long COVID, please join our group if you're in healthcare, or just general people that you interact with every day, because people are willing to help, and for the most part willing to listen. It's unfortunate, things are politicized and all, but for the most part, people are really willing to listen. And at least then, I think too, for me, it helps because I worry if I'm out of breath with somebody, like, do they think I'm like out of shape and I'm not a good PT or AT? Or I tell people, because if I'm in an N95 in the clinic and I sometimes have to like, and I have to say, I'm not sighing at you. Like, so, I'm not mad at you. I'm not annoyed. I just need to breathe for a second. Or if it takes me a minute to like remember something, it's not that I'm zoning out and I don't care. It just, my brain needs a second. So people seem to have been like really understanding of that, which then hopefully they learn a little bit. And then, they're more receptive with other people also.
Good. There's just a lot to think of. And
yes. Yes.
And again, the part of the reason I love doing this podcast is because of conversations like this. There's so much I learned, so much, like, oh, hey, I got this rash on my wrist from my watch that I haven't ever had before, right? Just random stuff. And you presented twice, and in New Jersey and in San Diego, and you also have a course on MedBridge. So
actually, let me interrupt quick. So the course is, I am like featured in it for like a little bit. So this is actually good for everyone to know if anyone wants to like read up on all of this. So there's a physical therapist, Todd Davenport, who is in California, and he works clinically and academically and does research, and he specializes in chronic fatigue. So long COVID for many people looks like chronic fatigue. I'm always hesitant to say it is. There's still a lot we have to learn, but it presents very similar. So he already has like a wealth of knowledge on this. So he has it brand new. This just went up in the past week course, the first course of a few on long COVID. So he was really great and interviewed me and 3 other people from our long COVID physio executive board. He's also on the executive board to get the patient perspective. And that's been so important in this because unfortunately, many times in healthcare, it gets this paternalistic, like, oh, we're the clinician, we know better, And now patients are the one, I didn't say this before, I should have. Patients are the one who started this. We weren't being heard 2 years ago. We kept saying, we're not better. It's been 2 weeks, like you said, and I'm not better. I'm so much worse than I was. Why aren't you listening? So we all said, all right, well, we're going to do this ourselves then. So there literally are patients who have started studies, which is amazing. Like I said, with long COVID physio, we started as peer support, but now we do education and advocacy. We're involved in research, we're involved in policy, we're involved with the World Health Organization. Like incredible things are going on. That's all like been a result of this. So yeah, that's it. So going back, MedBridge, yes. So that's Todd's course. I was really lucky to be like featured on, and there will be a couple more coming up.
All right. So I guess if you go to MedBridge and search long COVID, that'd be the best way to find that.
I don't know long. I know if you search COVID, it comes up. There are a few courses that are there, and his, when I searched it, it's the last one that comes up. But Todd Davenport, and if you go on PubMed and if you're interested, and look up his research related to ME and CFS, a lot of it applies to what we're seeing now with long COVID.
Very good. All right, and then the 2 presentations you did, and like I said, in San Diego and then in New Jersey, were those roughly the same talks, same audience?
Different, very different. It's a good question. So I'll start with the ATSNJ. They're fabulous. That was the science. I got like right into what we know, what you need to look at, how to assess for it, how to management, a lot of science. I'll talk about me a little bit, but lots of science. Versus the San Diego Pain Summit is really neat. I just read PT Sandy Hill and gave a really good description of it. It's more of a thinky kind of conference, not a hands-on, what do I do, kind of conference. It's very cerebral, which I love. So they're big on getting the patient perspectives. So I spoke both as a patient and a clinician. So I went over some of the science. I didn't have to go too in depth with the post-exertional symptom exacerbation because Todd Davenport spoke right after me about all of that, which is great because it's a big topic. But I talked a lot about my lived experience. And so not just here's a list of symptoms, but like here's how they affect me. Like as a person, here's what I'm going through. Here are the struggles that I have. I got into, like I said earlier, different ways I'm trying to manage the symptoms and things that we're dealing with as healthcare clinicians and as researchers and educators, what we're dealing with from our own colleagues sometimes. like actually in both presentations, I think I brought up, I was interviewed, me and Darren Brown, our long COVID physio chair, were interviewed in the Atlantic magazine by Ed Young, who's a journalist who got a Pulitzer for his coverage of the pandemic, specifically about healthcare workers not being believed by our own healthcare colleagues about our symptoms. So that's a whole thing I go into a lot too. So San Diego Pain Summit was perfect to talk about my lived experience in addition to the science.
So very cool. Yeah, I know you got some feedback on social media from people just saying, "Hey, thanks
Yeah,
for sharing your experience." So, congratulations there on that.
thanks.
And I know it's just out of a heart for sharing, and not that you're seeking praise, but very cool.
Yes, that's been a neat thing to see. So my professionally, typically in orthopedics, I see some patients with some long-term conditions, I'm in an industrial setting, construction workers. So really being immersed in this like chronic illness community is really brand new to me. And that's what I've learned from other people with whether they have a chronic illness or they're clinicians who work with people with chronic illnesses, is to tell your story, get your story out, be heard. And I'm in a position as an AT and PT, I can, I have a little platform, I can be a voice and say, unfortunately, if whatever clinician isn't listening to this patient, maybe they'll listen to me more because I can talk a little bit of the science and the healthcare with them too. And I recognize that not everybody with long COVID is comfortable being public about it. I know plenty of healthcare workers who will DM me privately and just choose not to speak about it, choose not to be in our group, which is understandable, but I am comfortable with it. So I figure I might as well use the voice that I have and try to educate people on it. And then also let people know that they're not alone and there's other people going through it.
Yeah, it is such an interesting thing because just recently, I'm going to come back to this just a second, but just recently, I've been sharing about, our foster care and that kind of things. And so some of the athletic trainers that are foster parents as well have been reaching out, "Hey, thanks for sharing your story. Thanks for, being an encouragement. Thanks for what you do," that kind of thing. And it's just like, well, I'm put here at this time for this reason to help encourage people. And so,
Yeah.
I think you kind of covered this, but Ryan Stevens from
Mm-hmm.
right there in your neck of the woods said, "What opportunities exist for athletic trainers to further dive into this and expand our understanding?"
Ooh, good question. So I'm going to plug Long COVID Physio again because we're wonderful. But on our website, that's longcovid.physio, super straightforward. We have a ton of free resources available, which is, I think, important because they're also so accessible because they're free and accessible in terms of people with disabilities. Our website covers if you need to change like font sizes and that kind of stuff. If you have any kind of disability, that's also up there. But if you look under our work, we have links to the things we've been involved in. So any other podcasts we've been on, any conference talks, the San Diego Pain Summit up there, that one is free to access. Those are there. You can see our published work in journals and our blogs coming from journals, websites. And under, I'm trying to remember now, resources, I think there's pages. So there would be one on long COVID with exercise, one on long COVID and heart rate monitoring. And there's all different topics that are in there too, because this is a really broad topic. So you could pick if there's a certain part you want to learn about, go into resources and you'll see those pages that are up there. That's probably, especially working in rehab, that's probably like one of the best resources. I know we're a little biased, but it's really great. Everything is updated regularly, like maybe not daily, but almost close to daily. So everything is really current because research comes out almost every day. It is wild how fast research is coming out. Has to be at least 100 journal articles that came out on long COVID just this year. So 2.5 months in. MedBridge, which I know you have your code, which is great. Todd's course is phenomenal. And I don't know if everyone knows this, but for COVID, all of the journal articles are free to access. So I know sometimes we get stuck if you're not at a university or hospital or somewhere that has subscriptions, you can go on PubMed and access everything, which is really great. I would say look predominantly at the PT literature and even OT. I haven't come across anything yet AT wise with long COVID, but those are going to be the good ones because they get into all of the into the rehabilitation kind of things. And then Twitter's been really great. I always feel like it sounds weird to say that because you think of social media is just fun, but it's been amazing with long COVID. So you could look at hashtag long COVID. My handle's on tap physio, and from there you could look at all the people I follow. But one example, David Petrino, who is at Mount Sinai in New York City, they're one of the leading experts on long COVID rehabilitation. They stepped up immediately 2 years ago. So he tweets a lot of great things. If you look up David Petrino, it's Putrino. On YouTube, there's some really great interviews with him too. So those are some really good options. So please, if you have any questions too, because there's so many in my head right now, you can all feel free to DM me and let me know. And there's currently outside of MedBridge, there aren't a ton of great courses if you're interested in CEUs. Some of them I've looked at and that's not going in the right direction. They're pushing exercise. We know exercise is dangerous. They're pushing cognitive behavioral therapy, which doesn't get at the underlying problem. But I'll make an exciting announcement. In September, we're going to have a virtual long COVID physio conference that is going to be hosted through Rocky Mountain University. So it will have CEUs available. So more information will be coming out on that in the next couple of months. So that'll be there too.
Very cool. Very cool. So longcovid.physio, which I don't think
Yep.
I've ever seen a website with .physio, so
Yeah.
that's cool. So
Yeah.
longcovid.physio, and then you said David Petrino, that's
Katrina.
P-A-T?
PU.
P-U-T, Petrino,
Yeah,
okay.
he's a really great resource. You can look on Twitter, and there's some really amazing interviews with him on YouTube too. And from there, you can literally just go down the rabbit hole of all the people to follow. If you look to on our website, the Long COVID Physio, our executive board under About Us, there most of us are very active on Twitter and share a lot of great information.
Very cool. All right. Best way to contact you?
Twitter, on tap physio.
On Tap Physio.
I'm on Twitter often. Oh, and
Uh,
just in case anyone sees, my account was suspended for a while, so I have On Tap Physio 2. It was from videos of copyrighted music. So On Tap Physio 2 is there. I use it a little bit, but On Tap Physio is the one that's best to contact me.
Gotcha. All right. Anything you feel like we've missed that is an important piece of long COVID?
Yes, two quick things.
Okay.
I forgot to mention earlier. One of the common symptoms, I think everyone knows about this with COVID, is loss of taste and smell. And people can have parosmia, which means that it can start to come back, but they have weird altered, like people will explain they smell burning, sulfur, sewage, just horrible things. They smell or taste it, which makes nutrition really difficult. Because people, are like, oh, I just lost my smell. Like that's a major thing. So if you're working with anyone, but let alone a physically active population, you also have to consider, are they getting their nutrition in that they need to be able to do their sport, do their job, just maintain like a basic baseline life every day. So make sure you're not downplaying, or like kids will joke about it, but that's actually serious. And there are young people who are really struggling to get in like their basic nutrition every day and have to have like Ensure shakes to try to get it. And then the last thing too, I like to stress this, long COVID is a mass disabling event. Like that sounds like I'm being like dramatic, but I'm not. It is mass disabling. And we are just starting to see how badly this is going to affect everything. So on one end, like I think that's a contributor to like the labor shortage and things because people physically can't return to their jobs. And you're going to see people who used to be able to do things and now they can't anymore. And there isn't necessarily help. It's not like you break a bone, you put a cast on or get surgery and you get better. So it's just know that it is coming. It's already here, but we're going to see it more and more and more. It is really concerning to see how large the estimated numbers are. It's up to 30% of people with COVID go on to long COVID. We don't know why. So I always remind myself of like mass disabling event. Everybody knows someone with long COVID. You might not realize it, but probably do. And people are going to start to be affected, whether it's going to school, just being able to sit in class. Think about like when kids have to return from a concussion, that return to learn. That kind of problem is happening now. People aren't able to just go out and socialize, talking about mental health. You can't do, say me, like I can't dance like I used to. I can't run. I can't just do the things that were stress relief. People are really, really struggling, and it affects so many aspects of your life. So you just have to like really recognize like how grave this situation is. Sorry to end on a sad note.
Nope, that's why I said that's why I give you the last chance to throw out anything out there. The altered taste and smell thing is something that I know I'd heard you lose it, but I hadn't heard that it was like altered. And I was talking with somebody just the other day, and it was one of our coaches, and he had it 6 months ago maybe, and he still is missing one of them, like taste or smell. And so it's really just like, wow, really?
Yeah, we don't
Those came
know.
back quick.
Yeah, some people it does. Some people have been well over a year that they don't have it. And there's people trying things like different like smell therapies with like essential oils and stuff. That's not going to hurt you, but we don't know if it helps. And something just came out looking at um, brain size changes, which is so sad. But seeing changes like in the olfactory part of your brain, that it's not just like at your nostrils, but it's actually like in your brain, that could be like where the problem is too. So it's not always just like, oh, let's practice smelling things, and like your brain actually can be altered, and that's why you're having that problem. Yeah, and we don't know when people get it back.
Lots of interesting conversations. All right. So my friend Daria Oler, physical therapist, athletic trainer in the New Jersey area. She's spoken multiple times. She's part of longcovid.physio. So if you want to know more information about it, that's a great place to start, is longcovid.physio. And again, just her sharing her experience helps so many different people, as she's done so much. So on Twitter, again, you can look at David, Putrino, David Petrino, or you can find On Tap Physio, which is Daria. there. So, Daria, I appreciate you joining us and catching your breath a few times during the podcast, making all the adjustments you had to make. This is sportsmedicinebroadcast.com/long COVID. If you decide to go with MedBridge, you can use the code DSMB, and that'll get you a discount and help us benefit the podcast. And go from there. So check that out if you're going to go through MedBridge, or like she said, PubMed has research articles, or start with longcovid.physio, or look for the upcoming, you said September or November?
September.
September.
Mm-hmm.
It should be the virtual long COVID conference.
Yes.
So
Yes.
for my friend across the country, Daria, for Jeremy, the Sports Medicine Broadcast, that is a wrap.
Thank you.